Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her, his voice carrying through the ER like a scalpel. Just a nurse. No Ivy League pedigree. No credential framed in mahogany. No country club membership with his father's name on the waiting list. Sarah Chen had been working night shift at St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio for 3 years, and in that time, she had saved 47 lives that the official records would never acknowledge. Dr. Pierce had no idea she was standing 20 feet away, restocking the crash cart with the kind of precision that belongs to someone who once held a rooftop for 9 hours while insurgent fire painted the air with copper and cordite. He didn't know that the folded flag in her locker, the one co-workers assumed belonged to an uncle, actually draped the casket of her spotter, the Marine who took the rounds meant for her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was running out of time to stay invisible. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's ER hummed their endless digital prayer as Sarah arrived at 11:53 p.m., 7 minutes before her shift began. The parking lot had been empty except for the night security guard, rain hammering the asphalt like applause for a performance no one was supposed to applaud. Her vehicle was a 2009 Ford Ranger, nothing memorable, nothing that drew attention, the same philosophy she applied to everything: show up, do the work, disappear. She was still wearing her rain jacket as she pushed through the employee entrance, water streaming off the canvas in rivulets that smelled like desert dust and hot metal. San Antonio at night had a particular sound: distant sirens, the hiss of traffic on I-37 miles away, and the grinding sound of the city's machinery running when most people slept. She made her way to the break room locker without greeting anyone, muscle memory carrying her through the corridors she had walked 3,000 times. The locker door creaked open. Inside, on the top shelf, was the flag. Folded in the military triangle, white on the outside, red beneath, it sat exactly where she had placed it the night before. One corner of the blue field had begun to fray slightly where her spotter's blood had dried on the fabric during the extraction in Tikrit. She had tried washing it 17 times. The stain never fully came out. She reached up and touched it once, her fingers barely making contact, then withdrew her hand and closed the locker door. The metal clicked. 63 seconds. That's how long she allowed herself every shift. Whose uncle? Sarah turned. It was Kelly from Pediatrics, already in her scrubs, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold break room air. Kelly had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that asked real questions instead of the ones that let you disappear. She'd been asking about the flag for 14 months. Marine, Sarah said. Tikrit. I'm sorry. Kelly's voice had the texture of genuine grief. That must have been hard. Sarah nodded once. It was a while ago. She turned and walked to her locker again, retrieving her own scrubs, size medium, though she was closer to size small. The extra fabric made her less visible, a walking shadow in polyester. The fabric was soft from 400 washings. She changed efficiently, movements economical, nothing wasted. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, but when she pulled off the rain jacket, Kelly could have seen the scar that ran down her left forearm if Kelly had been looking. Sarah had told people it was from a car accident in Phoenix. It wasn't. The night shift supervisor was already setting up assignments at the nurse's station when Sarah emerged from the locker room. St. Michael's was a 280-bed teaching hospital with an ER that handled roughly 180 patients daily, and on this particular Tuesday night, the waiting room was already half full by midnight. 3 new paramedic rigs were running accidents on I-37 after the rain had slicked the highways. The energy was that particular flavor of controlled chaos that Sarah had trained for, the kind of crisis that looked like pandemonium to civilians but read like a clear, logical sequence to someone whose nervous system had been calibrated by 3 tours through combat medicine. She moved to the crash cart in Trauma Bay 2, a stainless steel cabinet that held the difference between saved lives and flatlined monitors. The cart needed restocking after the previous shift's MI case. She opened the drawers with systematic precision. Tourniquet. Hemostats. Scalpel blade, number 11, the right choice for emergency airway procedures. 14-gauge angiocath needle for vein access. A vial of 1 mg epinephrine. Suction tubing with the connector attached. Each item went into position not because she was following a hospital protocol but because muscle memory from 100 field operations had encoded the optimal arrangement into her nervous system. Her hands moved like someone playing a song she had learned so thoroughly that thinking would have slowed her down. Dr. Marcus Pierce watched from the physician's lounge doorway, Ivy League diploma framed on his office wall like a medieval knight's coat of arms. He was 41, had graduated from Columbia Medical School in the top 15%, and had worked exactly 2 years in a real ER before moving into administrative positions where he could minimize his exposure to people who hadn't attended expensive universities. He'd been at St. Michael's for 6 months, brought in as an attending to elevate standards, which meant restructuring the department around credential hierarchies and the assumption that expensive education produced better doctors. Sarah's scrubs were rumpled. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band from the grocery store. Her shoes were nursing clogs, practical and worn, not the expensive leather ones that Pierce wore, the ones that squeaked when he walked to emphasize his arrival. She was restocking a cart like a janitor, Pierce thought. Like someone who had never considered that medicine was a science that required institutional authority, not just field experience and instinct. He was wrong about every single thing he believed about her, and he was only 20 minutes away from proving it. "Crash cart looks solid," said Marcus Holloway, one of the paramedic supervisors from the fire station on Woodlawn, leaning against the trauma bay door frame. Marcus had been running calls into St. Michael's for 8 years. He had seen 54 paramedics transition through his station, and he could identify the ones worth listening to in about 90 seconds. His crew had learned to ask Sarah's opinion before asking the attending physicians, and they'd learned to trust her judgment in ways they rarely trusted anyone else's. Marcus was watching Sarah arrange items in the crash cart, and he was thinking about the time she'd talked him through a hemodynamic instability call last month, a pediatric patient with penetrating abdominal trauma, and his gut instinct had been to transport immediately, but Sarah had said, "Not yet. Listen to the breath sounds." "What do you hear?" And Marcus had heard the asymmetry that indicated a developing tension pneumothorax that would have arrested the child in the ambulance if they hadn't intervened first. "You good for the night?" he asked. "Always," Sarah said. She didn't look up from the cart. Her voice was steady, almost flat, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst your circumstances can offer. Marcus nodded and walked back toward the ambulance bay. He was the type of man who understood that the quietest people in a room were often holding it together with their hands, their skills, and their absolute refusal to break. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office at 12:37 a.m., making his rounds through the ER with the posture of someone inspecting a property he intended to renovate. He moved past the nurse's station, past the waiting area where a woman with a sprained ankle was reading magazines from 2019, past the medication dispensary where Sarah was pulling supplies for an 4 setup. He had observed her 3 times in the past week, and each observation had confirmed his preliminary assessment, competent at the technical level, perhaps, but lacking the intellectual framework that separated good nurses from the ones who understood medicine as a hierarchical institution where authority derived from credential, not intuition. She was wearing latex gloves when he approached the nurse's station. She'd changed them 4 times in the past hour, maintaining contamination protocols that most nurses let slide during busy nights. Her chart notes from the previous patient were visible on the computer screen, abbreviated, efficient, missing the narrative flourishes that Pierce associated with quality documentation. No embellished histories. No elaborated assessments. Just data. Just what mattered. Just the kind of notes that looked like laziness to someone who had never lived inside an actual trauma scenario where every second counted and extra words were a luxury. "Nurse Chen," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ER like a tone people had been trained to recognize as authority. "I need to discuss your documentation." Sarah looked up from the medication cabinet. She was holding a vial of midazolam for sedation, her hand completely steady. Her eyes met his, and something flickered across Dr. Pierce's consciousness, just for a moment, something that suggested he might be missing a significant detail about the woman in front of him. The flicker lasted approximately 0.3 of a second, then his institutional certainty reasserted itself. "My notes?" Sarah asked. 8 words. Polite. Deferential. The inflection of someone accustomed to being questioned. Your chart documentation is dangerously abbreviated, Pierce said. I've reviewed 7 entries from your shifts over the past 2 weeks, and each one reads like shorthand. Like you can't be bothered with actual assessment narratives. Sarah waited. She was listening to the rhythm of his complaints the way a sniper listens to wind, gathering data, calculating vectors. Around them, the ER continued its organized chaos. A monitor beeped. A stretcher rattled past. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots in someone's exam room. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electronic prayer. The chart notes are efficient, Sarah said. Her voice had dropped slightly lower than it was a moment before, though only Marcus would have noticed. They contain what's essential. They contain what you think is essential, Pierce corrected. He was already walking away, having delivered the criticism, having asserted the hierarchy. But the institution requires more. The board requires more. You do well to remember that. Sarah turned back to the medication cabinet and continued organizing supplies with the same mechanical precision. She had been questioned by interrogators with actual interest in her answers. She had been threatened by people with actual power to carry out those threats. A physician with an Ivy League diploma and a 6-month tenure had very little claim on her attention. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had just initiated a pattern of escalation that would consume the next 5 hours and change everything. The conference room at St. Michael's Hospital smells like burnt coffee and anxiety. 30 physicians and nurses fill the tiered seats, their attention locked on the projection screen where Dr. Pierce has enlarged Sarah Chen's chart notes in a font so large it could be read from the parking lot. The abbreviations glow in neon red, PT coding, atropine 1 mg, ROSC 0347, each one circled with theatrical precision as though marking evidence at a crime scene. This, Pierce says, his voice carrying the kind of measured disappointment usually reserved for addressing interns who've contaminated sterile fields, is what passes for documentation on the night shift at St. Michael's Hospital. He paces in front of the screen like a prosecutor who has already won his case. His suit is Italian, charcoal grey, the kind that costs more than most nurses earn in a week. He moves with the confidence of a man who has never once questioned whether the room believed him. Dangerously abbreviated, he continues, circling another abbreviation with his laser pointer. Borders on malpractice, frankly. This nurse seems to believe we're writing telegram messages, not medical records that could determine whether this hospital faces litigation for inadequate documentation standards. Sarah stands in the back of the conference room, her scrubs navy blue against the institutional beige walls, her hands folded with the stillness of someone who has learned that movement draws attention. She watches Pierce perform his humiliation the way a sniper watches a target through glass, from a distance, without emotion. 10 minutes pass. 10 minutes of methodical dissection. 10 minutes of Pierce building his narrative that abbreviated notes equal carelessness equal danger equal incompetence. He moves through her charts like a surgeon working through tissue, each example minor, each one designed to accumulate into something larger. The silence in the room becomes a physical presence. Does anyone want to defend this level of carelessness? Pierce's question hangs in the air like a challenge no one will accept. The room stays mute. 30 medical professionals staring at their laps, their shoes, the foam containers of their cooling coffee. None of them will speak. This is how power works in institutions, not through guns but through the collective agreement to remain silent while one voice dominates. Sarah lets the silence stretch. She lets it become unbearable, lets it stretch so long that people begin to shift in their seats, that the fluorescent lights above seem to buzz louder, that the weight of 30 pairs of eyes waiting for something becomes almost visible. Then she locks eyes with Dr. Pierce across the conference room. Abbreviated because the patient was coding and I was doing your job. The words are delivered with perfect calm, no anger, no accusation, just a statement of fact. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The entire room heard her. Scattered nervous laughter ripples through the seats. Someone coughs. Pierce's face goes crimson, a color so deep it looks like something has punctured him internally. Sarah turns and walks out of the conference room without waiting for a response, her footsteps steady on the tile floor, her exit complete before Pierce can formulate a comeback. She doesn't look back. 3 days later, Sarah stands at the vending machines during her break, feeding dollar bills into the slot while thinking about anything except Dr. Pierce. The machine hums its mechanical rhythm as she presses the button for a granola bar. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a clinical white that makes even the Cheerios look suspicious. Pierce arrives with 2 residents following like remoras behind a shark. "There's our combat nurse," he announces, his voice pitched loud enough that the residents and any staff walking past will hear him clearly. He positions himself between Sarah and the exit, a casual placement, but deliberate. "Tell me, Florence Nightingale, does playing soldier with trauma shears actually qualify you to handle real trauma cases?" The contempt in his voice is so thick you could cut it with those same trauma shears. "Or should we start assigning you to the pediatric ward where the boo-boos are more your speed?" One resident laughs, a nervous, uncertain sound. The other shifts his weight from foot to foot, uncomfortable in a way that suggests he knows exactly what Pierce is doing and doesn't approve but lacks the rank to say so. Sarah's hands go absolutely still. She retrieves her granola bar from the slot with the same efficiency she'd use retrieving a scalpel from a crash cart. Then she turns to face Pierce, and her expression becomes a mask of glacial indifference, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has already survived worse things than this. "The last time I played soldier, Doctor, I kept for Marines breathing with a field kit and a prayer while mortars turned the building around us to rubble." Her voice drops an octave, becomes something with weight and authority. "How many trauma cases have you handled without an OR team to hold your hand?" She walks away before he can respond, leaving him standing at the vending machines with his mouth forming words his brain hasn't caught up to yet. The residents exchange a look. One of them, a surgery resident with more intuition than caution, makes a mental note about the night shift nurse with steady hands and steady eyes. Pierce's humiliation crystallizes in real time, and he makes a decision that will destroy him. Later that week, a paramedic radio crackles in the ER, incoming trauma from a training accident at Fort Sam Houston. Young male. Significant chest injury. ETA for minutes. Sarah is restocking the supply cart when the announcement hits, and her body goes rigid for exactly 1 second before she returns to her work with mechanical precision. She knows that voice pattern. She knows that the incoming patient is being called in military radio protocol. Corporal Vasquez. Her replacement in Tikrit. The ambulance bay doors burst open 12 minutes later, and Pierce is already there, already watching Sarah position herself in the trauma corridor with the kind of focused attention that makes him recognize an opportunity. He intercepts her as the paramedics wheel the stretcher toward Trauma Bay 3. "You're not going in there," Pierce says, his voice dripping certainty. That's a military case requiring physician oversight, not some washed-up wannabe who thinks wearing dog tags makes her qualified. His hand moves toward his phone, a gesture so transparent it might as well be a declaration of war. Sarah stares at him with such cold intensity that the smile on his face falters, then dies completely. Her eyes are the color of winter ocean. Her presence in the corridor seems to make the air pressure change. "Corporal Vasquez was my replacement in Tikrit," she says, each word a blade. "He's doing the job I taught him, and I'll be damned if I let him die doing it." Behind them, somewhere in the depths of Trauma Bay 3, Vasquez's heart monitor flatlines. The sound is sharp, terrible, a machine announcing catastrophe. Sarah turns away from Pierce without another word and walks straight into the trauma bay, leaving him standing in the hallway with his hand still on the phone and no one left to call. Vasquez is pale as hospital sheets. His chest rises unevenly, one side moving, the other locked, frozen. His skin has taken on that dusky blue quality that emergency medicine teaches you to recognize as imminent death. The attending physician is ordering an X-ray. The trauma nurse is calling for typo negative. Monitors are screaming their electronic warnings. But Sarah's already at the bedside, her hands moving with muscle memory that has nothing to do with civilian nursing. Her fingers palpate Vasquez's trachea, feeling for the deviation that confirms her diagnosis. There it is. The windpipe shifted. The lung collapsed. Tension pneumothorax. A Marine drowning in his own chest cavity. His lungs collapsed, tracheas shifted, he needs immediate decompression, she says, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from someone who has done this before under circumstances far worse than a sterile trauma bay. The thoracic surgeon is stuck in traffic on I-37, 20 minutes out. Vasquez's oxygen saturation reads 72%. His brain is dying. His organs are dying. Every second that passes is a second closer to permanent damage or death. Pierce storms into the trauma bay, his voice sharp with authority. We wait for qualified personnel. Hospital protocol clearly states. The oxygen saturation drops to 70%. Then 68%. The attending physician looks at Sarah, then at the monitor, then at a patient who is dying in real time while protocol breathes down his neck. He nods, barely a movement, but enough. Sarah doesn't wait. She pulls a 16-gauge needle from the crash cart with her left hand while her right hand preps the chest wall with betadine in 3 efficient strokes, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmarks burned into muscle memory from 12 years ago in a combat support hospital in Tikrit. She makes the incision between the ribs with movement so precise and controlled that they look choreographed, like she's performed this exact procedure 1,000 times in her sleep. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity is like a sigh of relief. She inserts her gloved finger to clear the pleural space, then slides in the chest tube with the kind of confidence that makes the attending physician step back and simply watch. Her hands move like they belong to someone who has done this in darkness and dust and mortar fire, not in a climate-controlled trauma bay with every modern medical device standing by. Vasquez's lung re-inflates. The entire trauma bay watches it happen on the monitor. O2 saturation climbs. 75%. 82%. 89%. Heart rate stabilizes. The monitor changes its song from screaming to steady, from chaos to rhythm. Sinus rhythm. A Marine's heart beating strong against the odds. 90 seconds. That's how long it takes Sarah to save Corporal Vasquez's life. The trauma bay goes silent except for the steady beep-beep-beep of a monitor showing stable vitals. The sound fills the space like a hymn. Pierce stands frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of rage and something worse, the unmistakable expression of a man watching his certainty collapse into ruin. The attending physician turns to Sarah, his voice carefully neutral. Where did you learn to do that? Sarah doesn't answer. She strips off her gloves and begins charting the procedure as though she hasn't just violated every administrative guideline in the hospital's policy manual. Her handwriting is perfect, steady, methodical. Each note precise. No abbreviations this time. Pierce's voice cuts through the moment like a knife through silk. That was an unauthorized invasive procedure performed by unlicensed personnel. I'm filing an incident report. Sarah keeps writing. Her hand doesn't tremble. Her pen doesn't hesitate. She doesn't look up at the man who has just announced his intention to destroy her career, and in that silence, in that absolute refusal to acknowledge his threat, lies something far more terrifying than any confrontation could have expressed. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitor flatlined the second Vasquez's stretcher crossed the trauma bay threshold. His body had arrived broken, a Humvee rollover at Fort Sam Houston, training exercise gone catastrophic, the kind of accident that reshapes how families understand the word unconscious. The paramedics had bagged him twice during transport, gotten him back twice, but his vitals were the color of a warning light, blood pressure 58/34, oxygen saturation dropping through the 60s like a stone in dark water, skin the shade of storm clouds before lightning. His right chest wasn't rising. Wasn't moving at all. Sarah was already moving toward trauma bay for when the ER attending, Dr. Reeves, called for a full crash setup. Vasquez's chart hadn't reached the screens yet, but she'd heard the radio call 20 minutes ago, 28-year-old male, blunt force trauma, multiple rib fractures, decreased breath sounds right side, and her hands had known before her brain had caught up. Muscle memory took over. The terrible, automatic clarity of someone who had held this exact death in her hands before, in a different country, at 2 a.m. under fire. Chest compressions began. The resident pumping Vasquez's sternum with the mechanical rhythm of someone praying through their forearms. 2 nurses inserting lines, one in the antecubital fossa, one in the groin, the femoral artery access point they'd need if this got worse. The respiratory therapist bagging him with controlled pressure, oxygen pushing through lungs that wouldn't expand evenly. The ventilator beside the bed was being assembled piece by piece, but it was already too late for the ventilator to matter. His right lung had collapsed. Not from the ventilator, from the trauma itself. A fractured rib had lacerated the pleural membrane, and air was now flooding the space between his lung and his chest wall. A tension pneumothorax. The pressure was building, compressing his heart, crushing the vessels that were supposed to pump blood to a brain that was already screaming for oxygen. His oxygen saturation read 58. Then 52. The numbers were going backward, which meant his body was dying faster than they could help him breathe. Tension pneumo on the right, Sarah said. Not a question. Statement of fact delivered without inflection, the way combat medics state diagnoses, information transfer, not emotion. Needle decompression won't hold. He needs a thoracostomy. The attending, Reeves, was already reaching for the needle kit. The 14-gauge catheter needle, the kind that would pierce the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, to create an emergency airway for the trapped air. It was the right move. It was also a temporary move. In trauma, temporary moves bought time, and time bought options. Vasquez's oxygen was 49 now. His heart rate was climbing into the 140s, that panicked electrical storm that meant the organ was running on fumes. Time was burning like jet fuel. "Where's the thoracic?" Reeves asked. His voice was steady, but his fingers weren't. The needle hesitated in his hand. "Traffic on IO 37, one of the nurses called. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes was 6 minutes too long." The needle went in. Air hissed out, the distinctive sound of pressure equalizing, like a tire deflating in high definition. Vasquez's oxygen climbed. 52, 58. 64, the temporary relief. But the lung was still collapsed. The air pocket was still growing. This wasn't a fix. This was a pause. "We need surgical intervention," Reeves said. He was looking at the clock. "We need." The ER doors had swung open behind them. Dr. Pierce, materializing the way vultures materialize above carrion. His arrival had the quality of a threat, not because of his medical knowledge, which was adequate, but because his presence meant protocol. Meant chains of command. Meant rules. Status, Pierce commanded, though his eyes weren't on Vasquez. They were on Sarah. Reeves updated him in 30 seconds. Pneumothorax, thoracic surgeon minutes out, temporary decompression purchased a window. Pierce's jaw tightened. He was the ER director. He had the authority. He was also the kind of physician who believed authority mattered more than options in moments like this, who saw in a Marine's dying body not a patient but a liability, a lawsuit vector, a reason to follow protocol to the letter instead of the spirit. "We wait for thoracic," Pierce said. Not a request. A command. "He won't make 12 minutes, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. The small voice of the night shift nurse was gone. What replaced it was flatter, older, the kind of calm that sounds like a tank idling in a garage, mechanical and infinite. Tension pneumothorax is decompensating. Another 3 minutes and his heart stops. "I'm aware of the physiology, Nurse Chen," Pierce said. The venom in her name sounded rehearsed. "Thoracic will be here. We follow protocol about waiting for qualified personnel." He turned his back to her. Turned to Reeves and the monitors and the choreography of a department following rules while a Marine in the center of the room was running out of blood, oxygen and heartbeats and time. Sarah moved. She didn't ask permission. Didn't hesitate. Didn't do any of the things that distinguish nurses from surgeons, civilians from combat soldiers, people who follow orders from people who understand that some moments don't allow for waiting. She reached for the scalpel in the crash cart. The instrument itself was nothing special: stainless steel, wicked edge, a surgeon's blade that had probably been used for suture removal that morning. But when she pulled it from its sterile sleeve, something in the room changed. The air pressure shifted. The other staff members, trained to defer to hierarchy and credentials and the careful ladders of hospital authority, froze. Sarah cut. The incision was made at the fourth intercostal space, at the anterior axillary line, the place where anatomy and desperation intersect. No hesitation. No trembling hand. The blade moved the way a blade moves when it belongs to someone who has done this under mortar fire, under conditions that make a hospital trauma bay look like a five-star resort. The skin opened cleanly. Blood welled. She didn't wipe it. Didn't look up. The scalpel stayed in her hand for the blunt dissection through the subcutaneous tissue and the intercostal muscles, the layers between the skin and the space where the lung lived. She was breathing controlled. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Pain is data, she thought, the way she'd thought it at 2 a.m. in Tikrit when her spotter was dying meters away and she had one more extraction to cover. This pain, this exposure of a chest cavity in a moving hospital, wasn't her pain. It was information. It was a roadmap. The pleural space opened. Air rushed out in a hiss so audible that one of the nurses flinched. Black blood spilled. That meant pulmonary contusion, lung tissue damage by the blunt force, but it meant also that the pressure was equalizing, that the heart was no longer being crushed, that the body had 3 more minutes instead of 3 minutes past collapse. Sarah's left hand moved into the space. No gloves. No hesitation. Her fingers found the lung, the texture like a deflated balloon, warm, slick with blood, and she positioned her hand to maintain the opening, to keep the air pathway expanded, to hold what had broken until the system could fix it properly. The oxygen monitor climbed. 72, 78. 85, sinus rhythm returned. The heart stopped that panicked electrical screaming and settled into the rhythm of survival. Vasquez's body had 7 more minutes now. 7 more minutes for the thoracic surgeon to arrive. 7 more minutes for the proper fix, the chest tube, the full surgical intervention, the things that happened when you had time. Dr. Reeves stepped forward without a word. Not to take over. To assist. To hand her the chest tube kit, to help her position the larger drainage system, to understand that what was happening in front of him wasn't a violation of scope. It was rescue. It was a Marine getting his life back from a body that had decided to betray him. Pierce's face went white. Then red. His hand moved toward his phone. Sarah didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the anger crystallizing in the space between them. She was focused on Vasquez's chest, on maintaining the opening, on the monitors, on the ticking countdown to thoracic's arrival. Everything else, the rules, the credentials, the hierarchy that Pierce believed in the way some people believe in God, everything else had burned away. The cardiac monitor showed a steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation, 91. Climbing. Stable. She had no idea what was about to happen in the next 36 hours. No way to know that Pierce was already composing the narrative that would erase what had just happened, that would transform her rescue into an atrocity, that would use the machinery of protocol and documentation and institutional power the way assassins use knives. The next morning, she arrived for night shift to find the email waiting. Not in her inbox, but copied to Human Resources, to the medical board's administrative liaison, to everyone who controlled whether or not she kept breathing. Subject line, Incident Report, Unauthorized Invasive Procedure. The language was precise. Clinical. The kind of precise that made violations sound like crimes. Unauthorized invasive procedures performed by unlicensed personnel, it read, in violation of Section 4.2.1 of the RN Scope of Practice, created significant liability exposure and endangered patient safety. That email was just the beginning. By afternoon, a second email arrived. This one to the State Medical Board. The subject line read, Formal Complaint, Nurse Performing Physician-Level Interventions. Pierce had written 12 pages describing Sarah's delusions of surgical competence, her reckless endangerment of a Marine Corps patient under her care, her apparent belief that nursing licensure qualifies her to perform emergency thoracotomy procedures. Reading the words in her hospital locker during her break, Sarah felt something like recognition. This was how it happened when you had to disappear. This was how institutions erased people. Not with violence. With documentation. By the next day, Pierce had escalated. He'd compiled what he called institutional analysis of the incident, 3 inches of paper stacked like a weapon. Joint Commission regulations pulled from obscure annexes. Hospital policy interpretations twisted until they looked like the truth. Witness statements that he'd coached from residents, each one saying variations of the same thing, that Nurse Chen had acted without authorization, that she'd violated scope of practice, that she'd performed surgery without medical degree or certification. He'd even included patient safety statistics, numbers he'd manipulated to suggest that nurse-performed procedures had higher complication rates. The statistics were real numbers from real studies, but they were being used the way liars use truth, selecting only the data that proved the conclusion he'd already decided on. The hospital administrator, Margaret Torres, called Sarah in at 2 p.m. on the second day. Margaret looked like someone who had chosen the wrong job. Her office was all windows and plants and the kind of neutral wall color that hospitals use to make you forget their institutions designed to control outcomes. She had Vasquez's chart open on her desk, and she had Pierce's documentation beside it, and she looked at Sarah the way people look at things they're about to destroy but don't want to. The procedure saved his life, Sarah said. Not a question. Statement. I understand, Margaret replied. Her voice was tired. But Dr. Pierce's documentation is extensive. The medical board is going to want a formal response. Without evidence of prior surgical training or physician oversight at the time of intervention, the hospital's liability exposure is significant. I'm sorry. Sarah wanted to laugh. She wanted to open her mouth and tell Margaret about Tikrit. About Fort Shank and the 47 field surgeries she'd performed while coordinated airstrikes were landing close enough to rattle the surgical table. About the Marine with the abdominal evisceration who'd survived because Captain Sarah Chen had inventory of her own hands and a working knowledge of how to put a human body back together under conditions that made a hospital look like a luxury resort. Instead, she said nothing. Because the truth was classified. Because her orders had been explicit: disappear, stay disappeared, never surface. Because admitting that she'd been military, that she'd held a captain's commission, would open doors that had been sealed for a reason. It would expose her daughter's benefits. It would violate the contract that had bought her this life of quiet. Margaret slid a letter across the desk. Effective immediately, Margaret said. I'm sorry. The words on the paper were still moving when Sarah read them. Gross violation of scope of practice. Termination of employment. Severance in accordance with hospital policy. The letter was signed by Pierce, approved by Margaret, finalized by the institution that had decided that protocol mattered more than lives. Sarah signed the acknowledgement form. The ER badge was surrendered at security. The locker was packed by a supervisor who wouldn't meet her eyes. By 5 p.m., exactly 5 hours after she'd saved Corporal Vasquez's life, Sarah Chen was no longer a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital. She was unemployed. She was erased. And she had no way to fight back without revealing the very thing that erasure was designed to protect. The termination letter sat on her lap, 3 pages of sanitized language that meant only one thing: she was gone. Gross violation of scope of practice. Unauthorized invasive procedures performed by unlicensed personnel. Immediate separation from employment, effective immediately. The words swam together. Sarah didn't remember walking out of the administrator's office. Didn't remember turning in her badge, her access card, the trauma shears that had been in her locker for 3 years. The badge clattered on the desk in front of the HR director, and the sound was so loud it cracked something inside her chest. 5 hours. She had saved Corporal Vasquez's life at 2:17 p.m. By 7:33 p.m., she was unemployable. Now it was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Sarah sat at her kitchen table wearing scrubs still damp with someone else's blood. Not Vasquez's, his bleeding had stopped the moment her hands decompressed his chest cavity. She didn't know whose blood stained the cuff of her sleeve. Didn't care anymore. The scrubs clung to her skin like a betrayal. She hadn't changed because changing meant accepting that she wouldn't be wearing them again. Changing meant admitting that the life she'd built, the careful invisible life, had collapsed in the time it took a surgeon to drive through traffic. The paperwork spread across the table was a roadmap to erasure. Severance calculations that amounted to 3 weeks' pay. COBRA insurance forms that cost more than her rent. Unemployment instructions that asked if her termination was for cause or without cause. For cause, obviously. Gross violation. The phrase repeated in her head like a metronome. She had violated the scope of practice. She had performed a thoracotomy. She had saved a life. These facts were inseparable, and one of them had destroyed her. Her eyes burned, but she wasn't crying yet. Not quite. The tears were gathering, the way storm clouds gather at the horizon, and she was trying not to let them fall because if they fell she would have to admit that this was real. That Pierce had won. That the careful architecture of disappearance she'd constructed for 3 years, the night shifts, the quiet reputation, the refusal to stand out, had been demolished by a single act of competence. The front door opened. Small feet on linoleum, the rhythm of a backpack being dropped. Emma's voice came first, bright and oblivious. "Mommy, I'm home from school." Sarah's head snapped up. For a moment she couldn't process the wrongness of it. Emma was supposed to be at school for another hour. Emma's backpack was supposed to stay on her shoulders at the bus stop for another 60 minutes. The day's architecture had shifted, and everything that was supposed to happen at 4 p.m. was happening at 3 p.m. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, uniform jumper slightly crooked, pigtails coming loose. She was 7.5, going on 8, old enough to read the room but not old enough to understand what she was reading. Her daughter's eyes landed on Sarah, then on the papers scattered across the table, then back to Sarah. "Mommy." Emma's voice changed. The brightness drained out of it. "Why are you home when it's still daytime?" Sarah opened her mouth. Closed it. The tears came then, silent and hot, spilling down her face before she could stop them. She couldn't hide it. She couldn't composure it away or lock it down or pretend it wasn't happening. This was her daughter asking a question that only made sense if the world was breaking, and the world was breaking, and Sarah couldn't fix that with medical training or military training or any of the things she'd ever trained for. "Mommy." Emma moved closer, frightened now. "Why are you crying?" "Come here, baby." Sarah's voice fractured. She opened her arms and Emma climbed into her lap, 8 pounds of small human who depended entirely on a woman who could no longer provide for her. Sarah held her daughter and felt the silence of 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, a time that should not have existed in her schedule, expand around them like a collapsing star. "What happened?" Emma asked. "Are you sick?" "No." Sarah managed. "Mommy lost her job, honey." Emma didn't understand jobs. Emma understood that Mommy went to the hospital at night and came home tired and there was always money for groceries and always a new notebook for school. Emma didn't understand the fragility of it, the way it could all dissolve in 3 pages signed by an administrator who'd never once checked if Sarah's hands were steady or if her judgment under pressure was sound. To Emma, job loss was an abstract concept. To Sarah, it was the collapse of the careful apparatus that kept them alive. That night, when Emma was asleep in her bedroom, Sarah lay awake in the dark and did the math that never added up. She couldn't go to another hospital, the gross violation of scope of practice would follow her like a stain. She couldn't return to active duty. That door closed the moment she disappeared. Reactivating her commission would require explaining 3 years of civilian employment, 3 years of violating explicit orders to stay buried, 3 years of surface existence when she was supposed to be deep underground. The orders had been absolute: disappear, stay disappeared, never surface. The Pentagon's voice had been cold and formal. You never existed. Your unit never existed. Your service record is classified at presidential level. If you ever reveal your identity, if you ever surface, it will compromise ongoing operations and active personnel. You will not speak of Tikrit. You will not mention your rank. You will not claim your decorations. You will become a ghost, and ghosts do not contact their families or their units or anyone who might recognize them. And she'd followed those orders. For 3 years, Sarah Chen had been dead, and only a night shift nurse had been alive. It was the better bargain, or so she'd told herself. It meant Emma had a mother who came home. It meant there was a future that didn't involve the Pentagon calling at 2 a.m. with another deployment, another rooftop, another death to coordinate or prevent. At 2 a.m., Sarah got up. She moved through the dark house with the precision of someone who'd navigated far worse. Emma's door was closed, the hum of her white noise machine steady through the wall. Sarah went to her own bedroom, to the bottom of her locker, and lifted the folded flag. It was small enough to hold in one hand. The fabric had faded from navy blue to something closer to slate. The folds were permanent now, creases worn deep from 3 years of being held and refolded and held again. Lance Corporal Marcus Rivera's flag. Her spotter. The last person extracted from the Tikrit rooftop, and only because Marcus had covered her medical evacuation of the wounded, and only because Marcus's overwatch position gave him sight lines that made him the kill priority. He died so she could live. And she'd lived in a way that made his death feel like the waste it was, erased, invisible, saved by someone she could never acknowledge and for a reason she could never explain. She held the flag and thought about Emma asking why she was home at 3 p.m. She thought about the next conversation with her daughter, the one where she explained that money would be tighter, that the house might look different soon, that sometimes people who help people get punished for it anyway. She thought about 17 years of military service that didn't exist. 47 field surgeries that were never performed. A Navy Cross citation that would never be read aloud. A rooftop defense that was classified so deep it was buried with the bodies. The folded flag felt heavier than it should. Marcus's flag. Her failure to keep him alive. The weight of every choice that had led her from that rooftop to a 3 p.m. Tuesday in San Antonio, to a kitchen table with termination papers, to a daughter who no longer understood why her mother was home. In the ICU at St. Michael's, Corporal Vasquez couldn't sleep either. He kept asking the night nurses about the woman who saved me. They gave him evasive answers. She no longer works at the hospital. She's been reassigned. But Vasquez had been trained by Sarah himself, back in Tikrit. He knew the difference between an answer and the truth. He knew something was wrong. And he wasn't the kind of Marine who accepted wrong answers. Fat Hill pushed through the ICU doors carrying flowers wrapped in tissue paper, his translator's badge clipped to his jacket, the same one he'd worn during those 9 hours on the rooftop in Tikrit when the woman ahead of him had held off 17 insurgents with nothing but rifle fire and will. The flowers nearly dropped from his hands when he saw her checking Vasquez's vitals. Not a nurse. Not anymore. The way she moved, the precision, the absolute authority in her posture, he knew that silhouette. He'd watched it from behind crates while bullets scorched the air above his head. His voice came out as a whisper, barely audible above the ventilator's wheeze, hummingbird. Sarah's hand stilled on the fall line. She turned slowly, and Fat Hill saw recognition flicker across her face, not surprise, but acknowledgement. The kind that comes from seeing a ghost you thought you'd never encounter again. Vasquez, alert despite the morphine drip softening his edges, turned his head toward the translator. What does that mean? His voice was hoarse, damaged from the breathing tube. Who's Hummingbird? Fat Hill set the flowers down with trembling hands. His English came in halting phrases, each word weighted with memory. She is Captain. Captain Sarah Chen. In Tikrit, 2019, she held a rooftop. 9 hours. 17 insurgents. She saved for Marines that day. Pulled them to safety while calling in airstrikes. He looked directly at Sarah, tears beginning to form. She never spoke about herself. Never once. But I saw her face in every village we visited after that day. They all knew. Everyone knew who held that line. Vasquez's eyes widened. He moved despite the chest tube, ignoring the spike of pain that came with sudden motion. "Give me my phone." Not a request. An order from a Marine who suddenly understood everything. "Now." "I'm calling Fort Sam Houston." Within 40 minutes, the ICU felt less like a hospital ward and more like a military formation. A Marine colonel walked in carrying a manila folder thick with declassified documentation, his uniform pressed so sharply the creases could cut. He stopped at the foot of Vasquez's bed and locked eyes with Sarah. "Captain Chen. I'm Colonel Hendricks, 1st Marine Division. I need to read something into the record." His voice carried the weight of official ceremony. Bronze Star with Valor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. He paused, letting that settle. Purple Heart. 2 of them. Second awarded for severe trauma wounds sustained during Operation Tikrit. Another pause. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. Citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as the senior medical officer attached to Task Force Black Horse, conducting classified counterinsurgency operations in Tikrit, Iraq." On the morning of April 14, 2019, Captain Chen held a defensive position under sustained enemy fire for 9 hours, coordinated multi-aircraft fire support, evacuated for critically wounded Marines, and personally performed 12 emergency field surgical interventions under active combat conditions. Her actions directly resulted in the preservation of 4 Marine lives and were instrumental in the success of the mission. The room had gone silent except for the machines. The sound of monitors beeping seemed louder now, more insistent, as if even the equipment understood the magnitude of what was being spoken aloud. Vasquez's jaw tightened. Fadhil covered his mouth with his hand. Then the general walked in. 2 stars. General Margaret Wade, Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command. She moved with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, like the atmosphere itself recognized her authority. She walked directly to Sarah without hesitation, stopped exactly 3 feet away, and executed a perfect salute, fist to heart, arm rising, a gesture of absolute respect. The kind of salute you give to warriors you served alongside. The decorations on Sarah's civilian scrubs, the flag pin, the small ribbon she'd worn hidden under her collar for 3 years, caught the fluorescent light like recognition itself. Wade held the salute for 3 seconds. That was all. Then, "Welcome home, Captain." The words hit like a physical force. Dr. Pierce arrived 90 seconds later, still in his pressed white coat, his name embroidered on the chest with enough arrogance for 6 surgeons. He stopped in the doorway and saw a 2-star general, a colonel with declassified military records, Sarah Chen standing in the center of the room, no longer hiding. His face went through 5 expressions in 3 seconds, confusion, then rage, then the awful realization that he'd just tried to destroy someone protected by the Pentagon. He opened his mouth to speak before his brain caught up with his ego. There must be some mistake in these records. Procedural irregularities in personnel files are common, and without proper verification. Wade turned to face him, and her eyes could have frozen blood. "Are you questioning the authenticity of Marine Corps service records, Dr. Pierce?" Her voice had the flat edge of a weapon being drawn. Pierce backpedaled, pivoting into institutional authority like it was armor. "The hospital has liability concerns." Nurse Chen performed procedures outside her scope of practice, and without documentation of equivalent training. Hendricks raised the declassified file. His voice cut across the room. 47 documented field surgical interventions. 12 emergency thoracotomies under combat conditions. All of them life-saving. All of them performed while under direct enemy fire. The number hung in the air like an indictment, heavy and undeniable. Pierce made his fatal mistake. The words came from his mouth before he could stop them. "Those records are clearly fabricated. I've reviewed Nurse Chen's personnel file myself, and there's no indication of military surgical training." In fact, he stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that comes right before everything falls apart. He'd just admitted to accessing a classified military personnel file. On record. In front of 2 senior Marine Corps officers. Wade's eyes narrowed to slits. You reviewed her military file? When exactly? How did you access a classified Pentagon record using hospital credentials? Pierce tried to speak. Nothing came out but stuttering, through standard hospital verification processes. Hendricks was already on his phone. Within 20 minutes, the FBI's San Antonio field office received a call about unauthorized access to classified military records using fraudulent credentials. Federal crime. The kind that doesn't get swept under administrative rugs. That doesn't go away with a good lawyer and an Ivy League pedigree. The agents arrived at 6:08 a.m. the next morning, moving through St. Michael's with the precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. They walked directly to Pierce's office, executed a search warrant, and found everything they needed: digital fingerprints all over unauthorized military database access, draft incident reports predated to before Vasquez's arrival, fabricated patient charts designed to show a pattern of incompetence that never existed, emails to medical board members containing provably false statements. Pierce had been constructing his case not just against Sarah, he'd been building insurance. If she ever tried to defend herself with her military background, he was planning to claim the entire thing was fabricated. The computer showed his searches: Captain Sarah Chen military records authenticity, how to challenge classified documentation, discrediting military service claims. Every search logged. Every one an indictment. When they placed the handcuffs on his wrists at 7:23 a.m., every staff member at St. Michael's stood at the nurse's station watching. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just watched as the man who'd orchestrated Sarah's destruction was walked out past the very people he'd tried to humiliate into submission. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The sound of justice being served with the precision of medical equipment. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes with her daughter Emma beside her in a new dress, both of them wearing the kind of clothes reserved for moments that matter. The room filled with people: Marines who'd served with her and kept her secret, medics she'd trained, other veterans who'd heard the Hummingbird legend and came to witness the woman behind it finally step into the light. General Wade stood at the podium. We ordered Captain Chen to disappear because her unit's operations required absolute secrecy. She obeyed that order even when it cost her career, her reputation, and nearly her freedom. Today we correct that injustice. The Secretary of Defense walked forward carrying the medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, hanging from a ribbon the color of blood. It was pinned to Sarah's uniform, the one she hadn't worn in 3 years, now bearing every decoration she'd earned but never displayed. Her daughter watched her mother receive the nation's second highest military honor, finally understanding why Mommy sometimes cried at the kitchen table, why she kept that folded flag in her locker, why she moved through the world like she was carrying weight no one else could see. Cameras flashed. Photographs captured the moment the invisible soldier finally came home. Vasquez attended in his dress blues, still recovering but standing straight to salute the captain who'd saved him twice. Fadhil sat in the audience crying openly, the woman who'd protected him during those 9 hours finally receiving recognition. Sarah accepted a job training military medics at Fort Sam Houston, teaching the next generation the skills that kept her alive and brought her home. And Dr. Pierce taught CPR fundamentals at a community college in Austin for $15 an hour, his Ivy League degree stored in a unit he could barely afford to keep. He watched the Pentagon ceremony on his phone during break, saw Sarah receiving honors he'd spent his career chasing through politics instead of service, and closed the browser before the ceremony ended. Emma reached up and took her mother's hand. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Chen stopped living as a ghost and started living as herself. The quiet warrior had finally come home. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about the hidden strength in quiet people. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to. Welcome home.